We've got this in there and everything seems to be working. Now let's get Google sign in working. So let's go to our sign in method and make sure Google's enabled. Also, make sure that everything's configured the way you want it because the end user is going to see your application name and everything else. You can also whitelist certain clients and do different web configs, which we're not really going to play around with because obviously we're working with Firebase. But special note, you must have that SHA-1 fingerprint in place. If you skip that step, this is where your application is going to fail. All right, so we've got Google sign in there. Let's go. You can see we have two different anonymous authentications. That's from us playing around in the previous tutorial. Let's open this up. And I'm actually going to copy these right here. Space this out just a little bit. So that looks much better in our emulator. So we're signed in. We're going to go ahead and sign out. We're going to actually kill the whole app. And let's add another function here. So we've got our snazzy little sign in Google, and we're going to say Google sign in account. And we want the Google user. We're going to await. Google sign in. If you're wondering where I got that underscore Google sign in, it's from the previous one where I just said let's go ahead and add this in right here. And let's say Google sign in authentication. Because remember, the user is different than the actual authentication. So we're going to say Google Auth. We want to take the Google user and we want to authenticate that user. Now, what we need to do here is a little bit tricky. Not only are we using Google Sign-In, but we're using Google Sign-In through Firebase, because you can use Google Sign-In without Firebase, but this is actually combined. If you don't do it with Firebase, it will never show up in your Firebase console. The user will still log in on your end device, but you'll never have a record of it in Firebase, which in turn will mess up all your analytics. So let's go ahead and go in here, and we'll say final Firebase user, and we're going to await maybe, there we go, auth dot, and we want to sign in with Google. You can see here it wants a token ID and an access token. So for the token ID, let's give it a Google Auth, and we want to do the access token. I think I got that backwards. Yeah, I do. Let's get rid of that. We want the ID token. There we go. And then let's do Google Auth. So what are those two things? Well, you have an ID token, which is your identifier, and then you have an access token, which allows them to access the application over and over again, at least until their password changes or you sign them out. So you have an identifier and a token. That's really all you need to understand at that point. We say if user not equal null, is anonymous equals false. Because remember, at this point, we are not anonymous. We have an actual login. And let's just do our set state. Signed in with Google. And we're just going to do else. If something bad happened, we're going to set state. And we are just going to say status Google sign-in failed. Let's add yet another button here. And we want our sign in with Google. Let's go ahead and build and run. Pull up our emulator. Shouldn't take too long to build and run this, but we did just make a lot of changes to the application, so we'll see what happens here. All right, there's our APK. Ooh, didn't like that. Let's actually change our application up just a little bit here. I'm going to completely get rid of this row rather than messing around with it. It's going to just drive me nuts if it offs the screen like that. Okay. Let's rerun this, make sure everything looks good. There's all sorts of tips and tricks that we could have done, but I really didn't want to play around with it. All right, so we've got sign out. We're not authenticated anyway. Sign in anonymously and sign in with Gurger. I should probably fix that. Thank you, hot reloading. Google. There we go. So just to test, we can sign in anonymously. Let's go ahead and sign out. Now let's sign in with Google and see what happens. And we get this choose the account. Now this is where your dummy account comes in really handy. About 5 seconds after I publish this video course, voidrum005@gmail.com is going to be obliterated. I highly suggest you use dummy accounts. And we are now signed up with Google. If you had not previously signed into the Play Store, you didn't have your password cached, whatever, it's going to actually prompt you for a password at that point. When we go back out to Firebase and let's look at our authentication, you can see now that we have an extra anonymous, that was the one we just did, and we've got our voidrums005@gmail dummy account, and the provider is this beautiful G, meaning we signed in with the Google provider.